The ice under the South Pole is moving. It slides about 10 meters a year, carried outward from the center of Antarctica by the whole weight of a frozen mass more than 2,700 meters thick. So the exact spot two rival parties were racing toward in 1911 was never really fixed to anything at all. It sat on a plateau nearly 2,835 meters above sea level, one of the coldest, driest, most featureless stretches of ground on Earth, a place where the sun does not set for months, and then does not rise for months, and where no rock, no plant, and until very recently no human being had ever stood. For most of the 19th century, ships that tried to reach it turned back at a wall of ice hundreds of feet high, a barrier no vessel could sail through and no one had found a way around. Only in the final years of that century did a handful of expeditions finally push past that wall and winter on the ice itself, discovering in the process exactly how much the human body could be made to suffer and still survive. By 1909, one of those expeditions had come within 97 nautical miles of the pole and turned back rather than die reaching it. And that same year, two rival Americans each claimed to have already planted a flag at the opposite end of the Earth, the North Pole, in a dispute neither side could ever fully settle. That left one pole still unclaimed, and within 2 years, two small carties, a Norwegian one and a British one, were on the ice at the same time, chasing the same fixed point on a map that was not, it turned out, quite as fixed as either of them believed. What decided which of them walked away from that race and which did not had already been settled months earlier, and choices made a world away from the ice. On 28 January 1841, a lookout aboard HMS Erebus called down that the ice ahead did not look like pack ice at all. Captain James Clark Ross climbed the rigging to see for himself and found a cliff of solid ice running east and west as far as either ship's glass could follow it, rising in places some 60 meters straight out of the sea, its face sheared flat as though cut with a blade. Erebus and its sister ship HMS Terror, two retired naval bomb vessels, reinforced for exactly this kind of work, had been sailing south for weeks through a sea thick with icebergs and pack ice, hunting for a way to the magnetic South Pole that Ross's own instruments told him lay somewhere beyond this coast. What lay in front of them now was not a coast. It was a wall, and it did not end. 2 days earlier, the same ships had passed a smoking mountain rising more than 3,700 meters out of the ice on a small island to the west, an active volcano nobody in Europe had known existed. Ross named it Erebus after his own ship, and the smaller peak beside it Terror after the other, and sailed on south, still looking for open water or open land. Instead, he found this barrier, a floating shelf of ice fed by glaciers grinding down off a continent nobody outside a handful of sealers and whalers had ever seen up close, its edge calving icebergs the size of small countries into a sea that would come to carry his own name. Ross sailed east along the barrier's face for several hundred kilometers, looking for a break, an inlet, any point where a man could step from a ship onto solid ground and walk south. He found none. The barrier ran on, featureless and identical, mile after mile, the noise of it, groaning and cracking under its own weight, audible from the deck long before the ships came close enough to see it clearly. The lateness of the season, and the risk of being frozen in himself, eventually forced Ross to turn the ships north again, back toward Tasmania, where he would spend the winter before trying again the following summer. He would make 2 more attempts at that same coastline over the next 2 years, charting more than 900 kilometers of it, and would never once find a way past the ice wall to the land he correctly suspected lay beyond it. Ross's own voyage had never been aimed at the geographic pole in the first place. He was hunting the South Magnetic Pole, the point where a compass needle points straight down rather than north, a target he had already located in the Arctic 10 years earlier and hoped to claim at both ends of the Earth in a single career. The Great Ice Barrier denied him that second prize as thoroughly as it denied him a landing, and the magnetic pole itself would not actually be reached by any expedition for another 68 years. No more accessible from the sea than the geographic pole the same wall also guarded. Ross's chart of what he called the Great Ice Barrier became for the rest of the century the outer limit of the known world in that direction. The southern continent, if it was a continent at all, and not simply an ocean full of ice, remained a shape sketched in dotted lines on the map, its interior guessed at rather than seen. Sealers and whalers worked the fringes of the Southern Ocean throughout the decades that followed, killing enormous numbers of fur seals and whales along island coastlines well north of Ross's Barrier, and occasionally sighting the mainland itself from a safe distance. But no expedition of the kind Ross had led went back to push at that wall again for more than 50 years. Exploring the far north still held most of the prestige and most of the funding available for polar work, and the businesslike killing of seals and whales, not the study of ice shelves, was what actually paid for most ships that went south at all. The shift became official on 3 August 1895, when the 6th International Geographical Congress, meeting in London, passed a resolution declaring that the exploration of the Antarctic was the greatest piece of geographical exploration still to be undertaken, and calling on the scientific societies of the world to promote it however they could. Belgium, Germany, Sweden, and Britain all began organizing expeditions within a few years of that single sentence, treating a resolution passed by a room full of geographers as something close to a starting gun. What changed by the final decade of the 19th century was less a discovery than a shift in fashion. Geographic societies in Europe began speaking of the Antarctic as the last true blank space left on any map, a phrase that did real work. It turned an ocean full of ice into a prize. A wave of national expeditions began to form, funded by governments and wealthy patrons eager to have their flag associated with whatever remained to be found down there. And one by one, through the 1890s, they sailed south past the whaling grounds, aiming not merely to chart the barrier's edge from a ship's deck, as Ross had, but to put men ashore on the continent itself and see for the first time what it was actually like to stand on Antarctic ground through an entire polar winter. One of the first of these ships to try wintering that far south would carry among its crew a young Norwegian first mate who had joined less for the pay than for the chance to learn firsthand what the far south actually demanded of a human body. What he would learn on that voyage, in the dark and the cold, and the slow unraveling of his shipmate's health, he would carry with him for the next 13 years, long after everyone else aboard had forgotten the ship's own name. By March of 1898, the Belgian ship Belgica had stopped moving forward, though nobody aboard had quite decided to stop. Her captain, Adrien de Gerlache, had lingered in the pack ice later into the season than any prudent commander would have chosen, hoping to push the ship's scientific program a little further south before winter closed in, and the ice had obliged him by closing in first. Getting even this far had already cost the expedition a life. On 22 January 1898, at sea south of Tierra del Fuego, a young Norwegian sailor named Karl Winke was swept overboard while clearing coal dust from the deck during a gale, and drowned before George LeConte, lowered on a line to reach him, could haul him back aboard. It was the expedition's first loss, and a warning, weeks before the ice ever closed around the ship, of how little margin this kind of voyage actually allowed. By 3 March, the Belgica was wedged solid, and de Gerlache's own private writing, by most accounts, showed a man beginning to realize that his ship and the 18 men aboard her would now spend an entire polar winter trapped in place, the first expedition in history to do so this far south, whether or not it had ever meant to. Among the crew were 2 men whose names would matter enormously to Antarctic history over the following 30 years, and who at this point were simply Belgian ship's junior officers doing a difficult job far from home. Roald Amundsen, a 25-year-old Norwegian, had signed on as first mate specifically because no other ship of his era offered a chance to winter this far south, reasoning correctly that whoever eventually went after the poles themselves would need to know things about cold weather survival that no European navy yet taught. Frederick Cook, an American physician with Arctic experience of his own, had signed on as the expedition's doctor. The darkness that closed over the ship in May 1898 was total, and it did not lift for more than 2 months. The crew, sailors from several different nations with little in common beyond the ship itself, had no experience of what unbroken polar night actually did to a person's mind and body over that length of time. Men grew listless and quarrelsome under the strain of it, and on 5 June 1898, a Belgian scientific officer named Emile Danko, already weakened by a heart condition he had not disclosed before the voyage, died at his post, the first of the crew to die from the winter itself rather than from an accident at sea. His companions buried him through a hole they cut in the ice, since the frozen ground offered no other grave, and the ship sailed on, trapped, with 1 fewer man to share the work of surviving it. The disease caused by a lack of vitamin C that rots the gums and weakens the blood, and that had killed sailors by the thousand for centuries, without anyone understanding why, began working through the rest of the crew as their stores of preserved food ran low on anything fresh. De Gerlache himself and his second-in-command, Georges Leconte, grew too weak from it to command effectively. It was Cook who pushed the fix that probably saved the expedition over real resistance from men who found it disgusting. Fresh seal and penguin meat, killed on the ice and eaten raw or barely cooked, in place of the tinned and salted stores that had caused the sickness in the first place. Nobody aboard the Belgica understood the actual chemistry of why this worked. It worked anyway, and men who had been too weak to stand began within weeks to recover. Cook also prescribed regular exercise, marching circuits around the trapped ship in the dark and the cold, rather than let the men simply wait out the winter motionless, and experimented with sitting crew members in front of an open fire for warmth and light he believed helped their mood as much as their bodies. An improvised treatment historians have since recognized as an early, unwitting form of light therapy for the depression the darkness brought on. Amundsen, watching all of this from his position as a junior officer with no medical authority of his own, absorbed a lesson that European expeditions had resisted for a very long time, that the people who already lived in the polar regions, the Inuit and Sami whose hunting and clothing and diet had adapted to this cold over thousands of years, generally knew more about surviving it than a naval officer's training manual did. The ice did not release the Belgica on its own. Through the southern spring of 1898 into 1899, the crew worked at cutting and blasting a channel through the pack toward open water, a slow, dangerous labor with hand tools and small explosive charges, hauling the ship forward meter by meter whenever a lead opened between the floes. On 14 March 1899, more than a year after becoming trapped, the Belgica finally broke free into open sea, ending an ordeal that had gathered scientific data no ship had ever recorded from that region, along with a toll on the crew's health and sanity that took most of them months to recover from once they reached port. For Amundsen, the voyage was not the triumph the expedition's official reports made it out to be. It was an apprenticeship, absorbed quietly while officially he was simply doing his job as first mate. He had watched what unbroken darkness did to untrained men, watched what fresh meat did for scurvy years before European medicine could fully explain it, and watched, closely, a physician's stubborn improvisation succeed where standard naval provisioning had failed. None of this made him famous. It made him, over the 13 years that followed, into precisely the kind of polar commander who would plan an expedition around what actually worked in that environment, rather than around what a European navy assumed should work, a distinction that would matter more than anyone aboard the Belgica could have guessed. On 2 November 1902, 3 men left the Discovery's winter quarters at McMurdo Sound with dog teams and sledges, walking out onto the same ice shelf James Clark Ross had sailed along without ever setting foot on 61 years before. Robert Falcon Scott commanded the party. Edward Wilson, a doctor and gifted natural history artist, and Ernest Shackleton, a merchant navy officer with an appetite for exactly this kind of risk, went with him. Their goal was simple to state and brutal to attempt: walk as far south across the barrier as a 3-man party with dogs could manage and come back alive. None of the 3 had any real experience handling sledge dogs, and it showed almost immediately. The dried fish brought along as dog food had spoiled somewhere on the long voyage south, and the dogs, undernourished and increasingly sick, grew weaker by the week rather than stronger, several dying outright, forcing the men to do more and more of the hauling themselves in harness alongside animals that were supposed to be doing the work for them. The sledge dogs' decline compounded a problem the party could not fix on the march. Animals that should have grown stronger on a working diet were instead being slowly poisoned by their own rations, a logistical failure traced back to a decision made in a warehouse thousands of kilometers away, long before any man or dog ever set foot on the barrier. Supporting parties turned back at intervals as planned, leaving Scott, Wilson, and Shackleton to press on alone across a landscape with no feature to judge distance by, beyond the sun's angle and the compass in a mittened hand. By December, all 3 men were showing the early signs of scurvy, the same disease that had nearly finished the Belgica's crew a few years earlier, though none of them yet fully understood why. Wilson, doing what he could with the medical knowledge of the day, suspected that the party's own tinned meat might be to blame for the sickness overtaking them, a suspicion closer to the truth than the era's official medical opinion, which still blamed scurvy on vague notions of general debility rather than any specific missing nutrient. He had no way to test the idea in the field and no fresh alternative to offer, so the three men marched on with a suspected cause they could not act on. Wilson worried especially about Shackleton, who was breathing with increasing difficulty and beginning to cough blood, a symptom historians now generally attribute to some combination of scurvy and a possible lung infection rather than any single clear cause. Frostbite blistered fingers and cheeks on the march, and snow blindness, the temporary damage sunlight reflected off endless white inflicts on unprotected eyes, left more than one of the three men navigating for days by touch and sound as much as sight. On 30 December 1902, with their surviving dogs nearly finished and their own strength failing, the three men reached a position they calculated at 82 degrees 17 minutes south, the farthest south any human expedition had ever traveled, and turned for home. The return journey undid whatever satisfaction the record might have given them. Shackleton, worsening by the day, could no longer pull his share of the sledge's weight, and by the final stretch had to be carried on it part of the way, an arrangement that shamed him more than the illness itself did, by every account of how he spoke about it afterward. Scott and Wilson, themselves weakening, hauled him and the remaining supplies the last miles back to the ship, reaching Discovery on 3 February 1903 in a state one of the relief ship's officers later described as barely recognizable as the fit young men who had left 3 months before. Shackleton's collapse became, in Scott's own judgment as expedition commander, grounds to send him home early on the relief ship, rather than risk his health through a second Antarctic winter. Whether this decision was purely medical or partly a matter of personality and command friction between the two men has been argued over by historians ever since, and the sources themselves disagree on how much of each was really at work. What is not in dispute is how Shackleton experienced it, as a humiliation, being invalid at home while lesser men, in his own estimation, got to stay and finish the expedition's work. He arrived back in Britain still weak, and still, by every account of those who knew him afterward, carrying a grievance that had very little to do with his lungs. The Discovery expedition's own final tally, once Scott and the rest of the shore party returned home in 1904, included real scientific achievement: the first detailed survey of a long stretch of the transantarctic mountains, meteorological and biological data gathered across 2 full winters, and a demonstrated proof that men could survive a long southern sledge journey and come back, however battered, to tell about it. But 82 degrees 17 minutes south was still more than 800 kilometers short of the pole itself, a gap that remained, as far as anyone in London or Oslo was concerned, entirely open to whoever tried next. The relief ship that carried Shackleton home also carried, unavoidably, the story of his collapse, told and retold in London drawing rooms in versions considerably less generous to him than the bare medical facts alone would have supported. Shackleton did not wait long. Within 4 years he was raising money for an expedition of his own, one that would not include Scott, would not depart from Scott's old base without friction over a promise made and then broken about that very point, and would be built, from its first planning meetings, around fixing every mistake the Discovery expedition's sledging parties had made. He had gone home from Antarctica once already carried on a sledge. He intended the next time to be the one who decided when the party turned back. Ernest Shackleton's own expedition landed near McMurdo Sound in early 1908 under something of a cloud. He had promised Scott before leaving Britain that he would not use Discovery's old base as his own, and pack ice along the coast that season left him little practical choice but to break that promise anyway, a decision that cost him a friendship he and Scott never fully repaired. What Shackleton's Nimrod expedition achieved that year, though, went a considerable way toward answering questions the Discovery expedition had only raised. A party from his shore team made the first ascent of Mount Erebus, the smoking volcano Ross had named 67 years earlier, and Shackleton himself, after an aborted early attempt, turned his full attention to the pole. Where Scott's party had relied on dogs handled badly and men hauling the difference, Shackleton gambled on a different animal entirely: Manchurian ponies, chosen partly on the advice of a fellow explorer who had used them in the Arctic, and partly because Shackleton, like most British officers of his generation, still distrusted dog driving as an unpleasant business better left to people other than gentlemen. The ponies performed poorly on the barrier's soft crevice snow, sinking through crusts that a dog's spread paws could cross safely, and one by one they had to be shot and eaten as the party pressed south, each dead pony lightening the load, but also erasing a little more of the expedition's pulling power. What Shackleton's party found next mattered more than either the dogs or the ponies. Somewhere past 83 degrees south, the flat ice of the barrier gave way to an enormous river of ice pouring down out of the Transantarctic Mountains, a glacier wide enough and with careful routing climbable enough to offer the first known path from sea level up onto the polar plateau itself. Shackleton named it after one of his expedition's financial backers, and the Beardmore Glacier became in an instant the single most valuable piece of geography in the whole southern hemisphere. A door through a mountain range that had, until that season, sealed the plateau off from anyone approaching from the sea. The plateau, once they reached it, punished them in a way the glacier climb had not prepared them for. At more than 3,000 meters above sea level, the air itself was thinner and colder than anything the expedition's clothing and rations had been designed around, and headaches, breathlessness, and a loss of appetite made every kilometer harder to force than the last, an effect none of the four fully understood as the simple thinness of the air rather than ordinary exhaustion, since high-altitude physiology was still poorly studied in 1908. The last ponies died or were shot before the plateau crossing even properly began. Shackleton, Frank Wild, Eric Marshall, and Jameson Adams to haul their own sledge across featureless, wind-scoured ice with rations that were already running short of what the remaining distance would actually require. While Shackleton's group pushed south, a second party from the same expedition, led by the geologist Edgeworth David, made its own long march in the opposite direction and became the first men to reach the South Magnetic Pole, the same shifting target Ross had originally sailed south hoping to claim 68 years earlier. Between the two parties, the Nimrod expedition answered, in a single season, two separate questions explorers had been chasing since Ross first met the ice barrier. On 9 January 1909, with their food nearly finished, and Marshall showing signs of a serious illness that some later assessments have attributed to a heart strain brought on by exhaustion and cold, Shackleton made the decision that would define his reputation for the rest of his life more than any other choice he ever made. The four men were at 88 degrees 23 minutes south, only 97 nautical miles from the pole itself, closer than any human being had ever come. Shackleton judged that closing that last gap and returning alive were no longer both possible, and turned the party north. He wrote afterward, in a phrase that stuck to the expedition for good, that they had shot their bolt, and that the whole of the tale in the end was 88 degrees 23 minutes south. Rationing on the return leg grew severe enough that Shackleton, on 31 January 1909, forced his own breakfast biscuit onto Wild, who was suffering badly by that point, over Wild's protest that his commander needed the food just as much. Wild recorded in his own diary that he would never forget the gesture and that no sum of money could have bought that single biscuit from him afterward. The return march nearly killed all four men anyway, on rations cut again and again to stretch across a distance longer than they had budgeted for, and they reached the coast only just in time to catch the Nimrod before she sailed without them. Shackleton came home not as the man who had reached the pole, but as the man who had come closer than anyone alive and chosen at the moment it mattered most to bring his companions back, rather than let ambition finish what the plateau had started. It made him, if anything, more famous than reaching the pole outright might have. It also left exactly 97 miles of blank map between Shackleton's turning point and the pole itself, a gap now measured precisely, its difficulty now understood in exhausting physical detail, and its glacier route already charted for whoever came next. Shackleton had not closed that gap. He had made it possible, for the first time, to see exactly how close it could be closed, and by how thin a margin a party might fail to close it and still come home to tell the story. In September 1909, within days of each other, two American explorers each announced to the world's newspapers that they had already reached the North Pole. Frederick Cook, the same physician who had nursed the Belgicus crew through scurvy a decade earlier, claimed to have reached it in April 1908. Robert Peary, a career Arctic explorer on his sixth attempt, claimed to have reached it in April 1909, and moved immediately to discredit Cook's earlier claim. Cook's reputation collapsed further when a separate claim of his, an ascent of Denali in Alaska he had made in 1906, was also challenged and eventually discredited by mountaineers who retraced his supposed route and found the photograph he had published was taken on a minor peak, far short of the true summit. The damage bled into his polar claim as well, and the National Geographic Society's own examination of Peary's records, conducted by a board Peary himself had a hand in selecting, endorsed his claim instead, a verdict serious historians have continued to question ever since, given how thin Peary's own surviving records turned out to be. The dispute that followed consumed the geographic societies of Europe and America for years, was never conclusively settled to everyone's satisfaction, and effectively closed the door on the North Pole as a prize still worth pursuing. Whatever the truth of either claim, the public had already decided the top of the world was taken. This left one man with a very specific problem. Roald Amundsen, the former Belgica first mate, had spent years since that voyage building a reputation of his own, most notably by leading the first expedition to sail all the way through the Northwest Passage, the sea route across the top of North America that had defeated or killed explorers for 3 centuries, a crossing he made between 1903 and 1906 in a small fishing boat named the Joa, spending 2 winters frozen in among Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic, and coming away, as he had from the Belgica voyage, convinced that their clothing, their dogs, and their hunting technique outperformed anything a European navy issued its men. He had borrowed a famous polar ship, the Fram, originally built for Fridtjof Nansen's own Arctic drift expedition, its rounded hull, designed specifically to rise up over crushing pack ice rather than be broken by it, a design Nansen had already proved by drifting the ship across the Arctic Ocean between 1893 and 1896. Nansen lent the ship to Amundsen for a new voyage, and raised money from Norwegian backers and his own ting for a specific, publicly announced plan: freeze the Fram into the pack ice north of Siberia and let the natural drift of the ice carry the ship slowly across the top of the world, close enough to the North Pole that a final dash by sledge could finish the job. Cook and Peary's dueling announcements made that entire plan pointless before Amundsen had even set sail. A ship's slow drift toward a pole 2 other men had already reached, disputed or not, would draw neither funding nor headlines. Amundsen did not cancel the expedition. He redirected it, in near total secrecy, toward the one pole still unclaimed by anyone. He told almost no one. His backers had funded a northern voyage and might well have withdrawn support, or handed the whole enterprise to a rival if they learned the actual destination before the ship had sailed. Robert Falcon Scott, meanwhile, was already in Britain, publicly organizing his own new expedition, the Terra Nova expedition, explicitly aimed at the South Pole, and Amundsen had every reason to think that announcing a competing plan openly would only spur Scott to move faster, or draw international pressure that might sink the whole venture before it began. Even most of the Fram's own crew, men who had signed on believing they were headed for a multi-year Arctic drift, were not told the truth of where they were actually going. Quietly, in the months before departure, the character of the expedition's supplies began to shift. Extra sledge dogs, close to 100 of them eventually, came aboard in Norway, animals suited to a fast overland dash rather than a slow Arctic drift. Amundsen drew on everything the Belgica voyage and his Northwest Passage expedition had taught him about depending on trained dogs, indigenous cold weather clothing, and lean, disciplined provisioning, rather than the larger, more elaborately equipped national expeditions that Britain tended to send south. Norway itself, independent from Sweden only since 1905, had its own reasons to want a clean national triumph on the ice, something Amundsen understood without needing anyone to spell it out for him. The Fram herself, once she reached the ice, did not stay idle either. Under her captain Thorvald Nilsen, she sailed back north to South America and conducted an independent oceanographic survey of the South Atlantic through the winter months, before returning south the following season to collect the shore party, a piece of scientific opportunism that used the ship's forced idle time productively rather than simply waiting at anchor. Amundsen himself had spent the years since the Belgica voyage reading obsessively into the accounts of every earlier polar expedition he could obtain, a private education that made him, by 1910, arguably the most thoroughly prepared polar commander of his generation. On 6 June 1910, the Fram sailed from Norway, flying as far as the public and most of the crew knew, toward the Bering Strait and an Arctic drift that would take years. Amundsen kept the true plan to himself a little longer still, waiting for a point in the voyage from which there could be no turning back and no leak that might reach Scott or the newspapers before he was ready. That point came at a small Portuguese island in the mid-Atlantic, the last useful port before the long run south, where the crew of the Fram were about to learn, all at once, exactly what expedition they had actually signed up for. At Madeira, in September 1910, Roald Amundsen finally told his crew where the Fram was actually going. He mustered the men on deck and explained that the North Pole was no longer worth the voyage, that he intended instead to compete for the South Pole, and that any man who wanted no part of it could leave the ship there and then, with his wages paid in full and no hard feelings attached. None of them left, whether out of loyalty, ambition, or simple lack of any better option that far from home. The whole crew signed on, in effect, for a different expedition than the one they had joined. Before the Fram sailed on from Madeira, Amundsen sent one more piece of communication north, a telegram addressed to Robert Falcon Scott, worded with a bluntness that gave away nothing beyond the bare fact itself. It reached Scott a few weeks later, in October 1910, in Melbourne, Australia, where the Terra Nova had put in during its own voyage south. The message told him only that the Fram was proceeding to the Antarctic, signed with Amundsen's own name. Scott's own expedition, up to that telegram, had been organized as something considerably broader than a pure dash for the pole. The Terra Nova expedition carried a large shore party, more than 60 men in total, once every scientific and support role was counted, tasked with geological survey, biological collection, meteorological observation, and a serious program of scientific publication, alongside whatever glory attached to reaching 90 degrees south. Scott had also brought, at real expense, 2 experimental motor sledges, a technology no one had yet proven could survive Antarctic conditions, on top of Siberian ponies, sledge dogs, and the option of man-hauling that his own discovery experience had left him, by most accounts, still cautiously fond of relying on when animals inevitably failed. Getting that expedition to Antarctica at all had already tested it severely. In the first days of December 1910, days after leaving New Zealand, grossly overloaded with coal, dogs, and stores, the Terra Nova ran into a heavy Southern Ocean storm that very nearly ended the whole enterprise before it began. Seas broke over the deck faster than the pumps could clear them, the main pump clogged, and rising water doused the engine room fires and stopped the engines altogether, forcing exhausted men to bail by hand with buckets while engineers worked chest-deep in freezing water to clear the blockage. The storm cost the expedition 2 ponies, a dog, several tons of coal, and hundreds of liters of the motor sledge's own fuel, washed overboard or ruined by seawater. Damage Scott's own account attributed to sheer bad luck, rather than any fault of preparation. 10 days later, the ship met the southern pack ice and sat stalled in it for 20 more days before breaking through, a delay that burned coal Scott had meant to hold in reserve for the shore operation ahead. The telegram changed the emotional register of that whole careful planning without changing much of its substance. Scott could not now simply organize a national scientific expedition that happened to include a run at the pole. He was, whether he had asked for it or not, in a race against a rival whose plans, methods, and timeline he knew almost nothing about beyond one flat sentence handed to him in a Melbourne port. Accounts from men who served under Scott describe a captain who tried outwardly to treat the news as a minor complication, while privately, in letters home, showing real anxiety about a Norwegian party whose dog-driving skill he had every reason, from his own discovery experience, to respect and fear. In one such letter, Scott admitted plainly that a dog-driving Norwegian party gave him more cause for worry than anything else the expedition might face, a rare moment of candor from a commander who otherwise kept his correspondence carefully composed for public consumption. For Norway, the stakes carried a weight beyond one expedition's glory. The country had become fully independent of Sweden only 5 years earlier, in 1905, still establishing itself internationally as a nation rather than a junior partner in someone else's union. With its own young king, Håkon VII, on a throne barely older than the Fram's own voyage. A Norwegian flag planted first at the bottom of the world would mean something at home that a British one, planted by a nation already accustomed to claiming firsts across the map for a century, simply could not mean in the same way. Both ships pressed on south through the final months of 1910. The Terra Nova reached the edge of the pack ice in December, fighting through belts of loose ice for days longer than Scott had budgeted for, burning coal and time he had meant to hold in reserve. The Fram, further along by then, and already familiar with the region from Amundsen's careful study of earlier expeditions' charts, made for a stretch of the ice shelf that Ross had first sailed along without landing, 70 years before, and that Amundsen had already decided offered the single fastest route south of anywhere else on the whole coast. The Terra Nova's own overloaded state that voyage was itself a product of the expedition's broad ambitions. Dogs, ponies, 2 motor sledges, scientific equipment, and enough coal in stores for years of operation, all had to fit aboard a single aging whaling ship built decades earlier for an entirely different trade. Amundsen's own ship carried a far narrower cargo by comparison, prioritizing dogs and sledging equipment over the scientific apparatus that filled a considerable portion of the Terra Nova's hold. A difference in loading list that mirrored, in cargo manifests, the same difference in philosophy that would decide the race itself. Neither captain yet knew exactly where the other intended to make camp. Within a matter of weeks, both of them would find out, and the shape of 2 very different expeditions, one lean and single-minded, one broad and scientifically ambitious, would start to show in the ground each of them chose to stand on. Amundsen brought the Fram into the Bay of Whales, a deep notch in the face of the ice shelf Ross had charted in 1841, in mid-January 1911. The choice startled British observers when they eventually learned of it, because the bay sat on the floating ice shelf itself, rather than on solid rock, ice that could in principle calve away into the sea, with a base camp still standing on it. Amundsen had studied the shelf's behavior at that spot across several previous expeditions' records, and judged the risk acceptable, in exchange for a decisive practical advantage. A base at the Bay of Whales sat roughly 100 kilometers closer to the pole than any camp on solid ground near McMurdo Sound could manage, a gap that would matter enormously to a plan built entirely around dogs covering distance fast. He named the camp Framheim, home of the Fram, and had it built and provisioned within weeks of landing. Scott, arriving at McMurdo Sound around the same time, chose solid volcanic rock at Cape Evans on Ross Island, in the shadow of Mount Erebus, still visibly smoking above the camp, exactly as it had when Ross named it 70 years earlier. The site was farther from the pole than Framheim, and Scott, once he learned exactly where Amundsen had actually made camp, understood precisely what that distance would cost him. But Cape Evans offered firmer ground, proximity to his own earlier discovery expedition's charted territory, and space enough for a shore operation built around considerably more than a single dash south. The 2 camps differed in character as much as in geography. Framheim housed 9 men total, every one of them there for a single narrow purpose: get a party to the pole and back using dogs, skis, and the harshest possible discipline about weight and speed. Cape Evans housed a much larger shore party, more than 25 men wintering there directly, running a full scientific program alongside the pole attempt, complete with a printed magazine the men produced themselves through the dark winter months, lectures on geology and biology delivered by expedition scientists to pass the endless nights, and a photographic and scientific record that Scott clearly intended to matter as much to history as the pole itself. Specific men carried specific responsibilities at Cape Evans that had no equivalent at the leaner Framheim. Cecil Mears managed the dog teams and had traveled to Siberia himself to select both the dogs and the ponies before the expedition ever sailed, while Bernard Day maintained the 2 motor sledges, machines that had already shown troubling signs during cold weather trials in Norway before the expedition even left Britain. Trouble Scott chose to proceed past rather than treat as disqualifying. Prefabricated in England and assembled on the beach within weeks of landing, ran to some 15 meters in length, insulated with seaweed packed between double walls, and organized firmly around rank, with the officers' and scientists' quarters at one end, nicknamed half-affectionately the tenements, separated from the enlisted men's mess by a wall of stacked crates. Framheim's much smaller hut, built to a design tested in Norway before the voyage, held all 9 men within a single shared space, a difference in scale that mirrored, in wood and canvas, the difference between the 2 expeditions' whole approach to the work ahead. Cape Evans's printed magazine, titled the South Polar Times, circulated hand-copied issues among the shore party through the dark months, filled with essays, sketches, and dry jokes about expedition life, that gave the men something to look forward to beyond the next meal. Both camps ate remarkably similar food that winter, whatever their differences in ambition. Seal and penguin meat killed and stored fresh nearby, tin stores brought from home, seal blubber burned for both heat and cooking fuel where wood or coal ran short. Fresh seal liver, in particular, though nobody at either base understood why, seemed to keep men noticeably healthier through the winter than tinned rations alone. A piece of dietary luck neither expedition's own doctors could yet explain in terms of vitamins nobody had identified. Men at both bases spent the 4 months of total winter darkness in roughly the same way, sleeping badly through the endless night, rationing lamp oil, and filling the hours with whatever work, reading, or invented amusement kept minds from fraying, the way the Belgica's crews had more than a decade before, in conditions considerably less prepared for than either of these camps now enjoyed. The dogs themselves received very different treatment at the two bases, a difference that would matter more than almost anything else once the actual dash began. Amundsen's Norwegian dog handlers, several of whom had genuine experience with sledge dogs from home, fed, trained, and rested their animals according to methods refined over generations of use in Scandinavia and the Arctic. Scott's dogs, handled largely by men without equivalent experience, fared worse from the start, echoing in miniature exactly the problem that had crippled Scott's own discovery sledging a decade earlier. Through the autumn months of February to April 1911, before the deepest winter darkness closed travel down entirely, both camps turned to the same urgent task, getting supplies laid out along the routes each intended to take the following summer, so that a party racing south the following October or November would not need to carry every pound of food and fuel for the entire distance on its own back. How carefully, and how far, each expedition managed that single piece of preparation would turn out to matter more than either commander could have guessed, while the depot parties were still out on the ice, marking each cache with a single black flag on a bamboo pole planted upright in a landscape with almost nothing else in it to tell 1 mile from the next. A depot in this landscape was nothing more than a mound of supplies, food, fuel, sometimes a spare sledge runner or a tin of matches, buried or stacked on the snow, and marked so it could be found again from a distance across ground with no other feature at all to navigate by. Both expeditions spent their autumn of 1911 laying a chain of these caches south of their respective bases, work that would decide, months later and hundreds of kilometers away, who among the men currently laying flags in the snow would still be alive by the following winter. Amundsen's approach to depot laying matched everything else about his planning, generous to the point of what some of his own men privately considered excess. His dog teams, still fresh and well-fed this early in the season, covered the distance to each planned depot quickly, and at each one his men left considerably more food and fuel than the bare minimum the return journey would require, marking the position not with a single flag but with a whole line of black flags spaced out for kilometers to either side of the depot itself, so that a party approaching from any angle, in any visibility, would cross that line and see at least one marker. Amundsen's own depot laying that autumn was not a single trip, but 3 separate journeys south between February and April 1911, each one pushing supplies further out onto the barrier, and each one, notably, continuing past the point his own plan strictly required, so that by the time winter closed travel down, his teams had already laid stores as far as 82 degrees south, a full 8 degrees of latitude beyond his own main base. Amundsen treated a missed depot, correctly, as equivalent to a death sentence in this landscape, and built his margin of safety accordingly. Scott's depot parties, by contrast, established a shorter chain of named camps closer to Cape Evans, Corner Camp and Safety Camp among them, relying more heavily on ponies, animals that struggled from the start on the barrier's softer snow in a way the dogs at Framheim, hundreds of kilometers to the east, were not struggling at all. Several ponies foundered or had to be turned back early, and the party's pace and range fell short of what Scott had originally planned before the season's difficulties cut short the more ambitious final leg toward 80 degrees south. The single most consequential depot of the whole expedition, meant to hold a large reserve of supplies at roughly 80 degrees south for the returning polar party to find the following autumn, ended up laid instead at approximately 79 degrees 29 minutes south, some 50 kilometers short of its intended position, a decision Scott made in the field as his ponies weakened, trading distance for the animal's survival and his party's safety in that moment. Historians have argued for more than a century over how much this single shortfall actually mattered, and the honest answer, by most careful accounts, is that it is impossible to know for certain what a depot 50 kilometers farther south would have changed, though several who have studied the expedition's own diaries and rations closely believe it would have mattered a great deal to a party already exhausted and out of fuel by the time it needed exactly that stretch of ice most. The depot itself, named for the roughly 1 ton of supplies eventually stored there, sat through the following winter as nothing more than a flagged mound in the snow, indistinguishable from any of a dozen others along the route, waiting for a return party that, when it finally came, would need every one of those 50 missing kilometers rather more badly than anyone laying the depot that autumn could have imagined. Each of Amundsen's depots typically held enough food and fuel for several weeks beyond the bare minimum a passing party would need, calculated deliberately high because a shortfall discovered only after passing the depot could not be corrected. Both expeditions marked their depots at round-degree intervals of latitude rather than arbitrary distances, a navigational convenience that let a tired party calculate, from its own sextant readings alone, roughly how far the next cache still lay without needing any other landmark. A depot's flag mattered more than its food in one crucial sense. Supplies buried without a marker visible from a safe distance were, in practical terms, supplies that did not exist, since no party exhausted and running short of fuel could afford to search blindly across ground with no other feature to guide it. Both commanders knew, in the abstract, that a missed depot on the return leg could kill a party outright. Only one of them built his margins as though he actually believed it. Neither Amundsen's excess of caution nor Scott's shortfall of it was visible to the other camp. Farthest and Cape Evans, separated by hundreds of kilometers of ice and a mountain range neither party had fully explored, worked through the same autumn toward the same eventual test, with no way of comparing notes, no way of knowing whether the other expedition's dogs were thriving or its ponies failing, and no way of knowing yet which of two very different philosophies of margin and risk would actually survive contact with the ice. By the time the deep winter darkness closed both camps down for 4 months of enforced waiting, the depot lines were laid, the flags were planted, and the question of who had prepared correctly had been settled in fact, if not yet in anyone's knowledge. It would take the return journey itself, still 8 months off, to reveal which mound of buried supplies had been placed exactly where it needed to be, and which one, however carefully marked with its own black flag, simply was not. This was not the party's first attempt to leave. An earlier attempt on 8 September, launched the moment temperatures briefly rose to a relatively mild -27 degrees Celsius, ended in near disaster within days when the temperature plunged to -56. Dogs' paws froze solid in their harnesses, and the party of 8 was forced to abandon equipment and straggle back to Farthest in separate groups over several difficult days. One of the 8, Hjalmar Johansen, an experienced and respected polar veteran, told Amundsen bluntly that what they had just done was not an expedition but a panic, a rebuke Amundsen neither forgot nor forgave. When the second attempt finally left, Johansen was not among the men chosen for the polar party, assigned instead to a supporting journey east, a decision that had at least as much to do with wounded pride as with any question of fitness. The retreat from the false start cost the party more than pride. Several dogs did not survive the ordeal, and the 8 men who straggled back to Farthest in separate small groups did so with frostbitten faces, and in at least one case, a frostbitten heel, serious enough to require weeks of recovery before the real departure could be attempted. Amundsen used the delay to rework his own plans once more, trimming the party from 8 men to 5 for the final push. A smaller, faster group he judged gave the best chance of speed without sacrificing the safety margin dogs and careful depot work had already built in. On 19 October 1911, 5 men left Farthest behind 4 sledges and 52 dogs, aiming for a gap in the Transantarctic mountains that no map yet showed a way through. Roald Amundsen led the party, Olaf Bjaaland, a champion skier chosen partly for that exact skill, Helmer Hansen, the party's chief navigator, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting rounded out the 5, each an experienced dog driver in his own right, each equipped with skis, light sledges, and a system of dog harnessing refined over the whole of the preceding winter's practice runs. Each sledge carried rations calculated with almost obsessive precision: biscuit, pemmican, a dried and pounded meat and fat concentrate borrowed from Arctic hunting tradition, chocolate, and dried milk, weighed out to the gram against exactly how many days the plan called for, and no more, a discipline that left little room for error, but also nothing wasted to carry. The pace they set in the opening days astonished even their own expectations, the dogs covering 25 to 30 kilometers on good days across the flat, hard-packed snow of the ice shelf, with the men skiing alongside or riding the sledges in turn, navigation handled by compass, sledge meter, widely calculated, with almost obsessive precision. And Hanssen's careful dead reckoning between the depot flags. The autumn's work had already laid down every degree of latitude along the route. Where Shackleton's ponies had floundered 3 years earlier, these dogs, bred and trained for exactly this work, simply ran. 2 weeks later, on 1 November 1911, Scott's own southern party left Cape Evans, a far larger and more mechanically complicated column than Amundsen's 5 men and 4 sledges. 16 men in total set out that day, split across different modes of transport: 2 motor sledges, driven ahead of the main party in the hope of proving the new technology's worth; 10 Siberian ponies, each pulling a loaded sledge and led by a man on foot; sledge dog teams, held in reserve for the barrier stage of the journey, and men on foot managing the whole strung-out procession, which moved from the very first day, considerably slower and less uniformly than the compact Norwegian party racing across the ice hundreds of kilometers to the west. Scott's plan called for the ponies and motor sledges to carry the party and its supplies across the barrier as far as the base of the Beardmore Glacier, at which point the ponies would be shot for depot meat, the dogs sent back to Cape Evans, and the climb up onto the polar plateau completed entirely by men hauling their own sledges, a method Scott trusted, by most accounts, more from personal conviction and his own discovery experience than from any controlled comparison of its efficiency against dogs. 12 of the 16 men were slated to make that climb in 3 4-man teams, with the remaining support parties turning back at intervals along the way. And only one team, its exact membership still undecided even as the march began, would go all the way to the pole itself. Within the first days, the difference in the 2 expeditions' methods was already visible to anyone watching either column move across the ice. Amundsen's dogs pulled loads far heavier than their own body weight at a steady trot, covering ground with almost mechanical regularity day after day, while Scott's motor sledges, untested in true Antarctic cold, began showing engine trouble almost immediately, and his ponies, sinking through soft surface crust that the dogs would have crossed without effort, tired faster than the schedule had allowed for. Neither party had any way of knowing, in these first days, exactly how the other was faring. Frameheim's 5 men skied west of a mountain range still unmapped in its detail, aiming for a route Amundsen was gambling existed somewhere in that unexplored wall based on nothing more than favorable terrain glimpsed from a distance the previous autumn. Cape Evans's 16 men trudged south along a route already charted by Shackleton 3 years before, certain of their path but uncertain, given the trouble already showing in their machines and their ponies, whether that certainty would be worth as much as it seemed. Scott's own preparations that same October involved a final round of equipment checks at Cape Evans, testing sledge runners, repairing harness, and packing rations that had been calculated back in England the previous year, a process that assumed conditions matching Shackleton's Nimrod expedition 3 years earlier, rather than anything the Terra Nova party had yet observed for itself. Both parties, for now, still had the whole plateau and the pole itself ahead of them, and more than 2 months of marching left before either one would know, for certain, who had actually gotten there first. Both of Scott's motor sledges were finished within the first 80 kilometers. Their air-cooled engines, designed and tested in Britain, rather than in the cold they now faced, cracked and seized in temperatures the machines had never been built to survive, and by 1 November the party abandoned them where they stood, man-hauling the roughly 150 kilograms of supplies they had carried the remaining distance to the next planned rendezvous. The experimental technology Scott had spent real money and real hope on proved in the end to be dead weight almost from the moment it left the ship. The 2 motor sledges had been an expensive gamble from the start. developed and tested on snow in Norway under Scott's own supervision. Trials that had not fully anticipated how differently the machine's engines would behave in the sustained, extreme cold of an actual Antarctic summer, rather than a short European test run. When the last one finally seized for good, the men detailed to haul its abandoned load by hand did so without much surprise, several having privately doubted the machines from the outset. The ponies lasted longer, but not much longer and not well. Built for cold weather but not for the specific combination of soft, crevasse-riddled snow and relentless daily marching the barrier demanded, they sank through crusts a dog's broader paw would have crossed cleanly, sweated through the effort, and then froze as that sweat turned to ice on their coats overnight, and grew steadily weaker on rations that could never quite keep pace with what the work demanded of them. One by one, at successive stopping points along the route, they were shot, their meat cached for the dog teams and for the returning parties to collect later, a grim, practical business that the men carrying it out gave the flattest possible names to. The stopping point at the very foot of the Beardmore Glacier, where the last of the ponies were shot on 9 December 1911, earned the nickname Shambles Camp among the men, a piece of dark humor that stuck to the spot in every account written afterward. Scott himself, in his diary through this stretch, wrote with evident frustration about the ponies suffering as much as the delay it caused, a discomfort with using animals this way that several of his own men, less sentimental about it, did not share. By the time the party reached the base of the Beardmore Glacier in early December, every pony was gone, and the sledge dogs, exactly as planned, turned back toward Cape Evans with their handlers, leaving the climb up onto the polar plateau to be made entirely on human muscle. 12 men, in 3 teams of 4, began hauling their own sledges up the glacier Shackleton had discovered and climbed 3 years earlier, each man now pulling a share of roughly 90 kilograms across crevassed, broken ice that demanded constant vigilance against a fall that could open the ground beneath a sledge runner without warning. More than one sledge, roped to the men hauling it, dropped partway into a hidden crevasse during the climb, jerking to a stop only because the rope held, and the men on the surface threw themselves flat and dug in against the sudden weight, a hazard that turned every day of the ascent into a slow, careful negotiation with ground that could not be trusted. The climb took the party the better part of 2 weeks, gaining more than 3,000 meters of elevation over a distance of roughly 100 kilometers, through a maze of pressure ridges and hidden crevasses that forced constant detours from the most direct line. Sunburn and snow blindness added themselves to the list of ailments, even as the party's rations, calculated for a fixed number of days, ticked steadily downward regardless of how much longer the actual climbing took. Roughly 1,200 kilometers to the west, at almost exactly the same point in the calendar, Amundsen's party faced the identical geographic problem, an unclimbed wall of mountains standing between the ice shelf and the plateau above it, with one crucial difference in their means of solving it. All 52 of their dogs were still alive, still pulling, and still, by every account the 5 men later gave, in considerably better condition than the men themselves were in after weeks of hard travel. The 2 expeditions had now converged, without either one knowing it, on the same essential physical bottleneck: get up through a mountain range and onto a plateau more than 3,000 meters above sea level, in cold and thin air that punished exposed skin and lungs alike, using whatever means of traction each commander had chosen, months before either of them ever left port to trust. One expedition would make that climb still riding, in effect, on the strength of animals bred over centuries for exactly this kind of cold. The other would make it entirely on the strength of its own men's legs and backs. A method Scott had chosen not because it was faster or safer, but because he trusted it, and because his own earlier failures with poorly handled dogs had taught him, wrongly as it would turn out, to trust it more than the alternative. Ahead of both parties now stood the glaciers themselves, Beardmore for Scott's 12, an unnamed wall for Amundsen's 5, each a climb of several thousand meters through crevasse fields that had already claimed, in Shackleton's day, more caution and more careful roping than almost any other stretch of the whole southern journey. What waited on the far side of each climb on the plateau itself was still unknown to either party in its specific character, though both commanders had reason, from Shackleton's own published account of his 1909 attempt, to expect thin air, brutal cold, and a featureless white plain that would test navigation and morale in equal measure for the hundreds of kilometers still separating each expedition from the pole. Amundsen's party found their way up through the mountains by a route they named the Axel Heiberg Glacier, after one of the expedition's financial backers. A steep, heavily creviced climb, but, to the relief of all 5 men, a passable one. Near its top, at a camp the party would afterwards simply call the butcher's shop, they carried out a plan agreed on long before they ever left Norway. 24 of their remaining dogs were shot, their meat divided between the surviving dogs and the men themselves, a deliberate reduction in the party's numbers, calculated to match exactly how much food the plateau crossing ahead would actually require them to carry. Amundsen had insisted before departure that the killing be done by the dogs' own regular drivers, rather than delegated to whoever was nearest, reasoning that the animals deserved at least the mercy of a familiar hand, a small private rule that did nothing to make the work itself easier on the men who carried it out. The men who did the shooting found it grim work, by their own later accounts, whatever the cold logic behind it. The meat, still warm, was fed immediately to the surviving dogs and eaten by the men themselves that same evening, a practical decision that spared precious pemmican rations for the harder stretch of plateau still ahead, though several of the party admitted afterward to a lingering discomfort with how efficiently the whole grim business had gone. It also worked exactly as intended, lightening the loads and feeding both the remaining 18 dogs and the 5 men on meat far fresher than anything carried from Framheim. On the Beardmore Glacier, Scott's supporting parties peeled away from the main column in stages, exactly as the plan called for, each group turning back toward Cape Evans at a specified point, so that food and fuel already carried that far would stretch to cover their own return, rather than being spent going forward. On 4 January 1912, at a position close to 87 degrees 32 minutes south, Scott sent back the last of these support teams, 3 men named Lieutenant Teddy Evans, Tom Crean, and William Lashley, and announced, to their evident surprise, that he would take 5 men onward to the pole, rather than the 4 the whole expedition's rationing, its tents, its cookers, and even its ski bindings had been sized and packed for. Wilson, Bowers, Oates, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans would go with him. Why Scott changed the number at this late stage remains one of the most argued over decisions of the entire expedition, and no single explanation, in his own surviving writing, settles it conclusively. The 3 men sent back that day nearly did not survive their own return journey, a fact that the fame of the 5 who continued on has tended to crowd out of the story. Lieutenant Evans, most severely affected, developed scurvy on the march back across the barrier, growing so weak that he could no longer walk unassisted, and by the final stretch had to be hauled on the sledge by Crean and Lashley, exactly the arrangement Shackleton had once been carried in a decade earlier under Scott's own command. When it became clear that Evans could go no farther and that all 3 men might die on the ice within reach of help, Crean set out alone, on foot, without skis, carrying nothing but a handful of biscuits and 2 sticks of chocolate, to cover the last stretch to Hut Point and bring back a rescue party. The march took him some 18 hours, and he arrived in a state so exhausted that the men who found him initially struggled to understand what he was telling them. It saved all 3 lives, and history has generally treated it as a footnote to the more famous drama unfolding, at that same moment, hundreds of kilometers farther south. That drama belonged now to 5 men rather than 4, hauling a sledge, a tent, and a Primus cooper, all packed and calculated in Britain for 4 men eating a fixed daily allowance. A 5th man meant either shorter individual portions or an unplanned drain on the reserve meant to carry the party home. A piece of arithmetic that the sledge's own manifest, unlike its human cargo, could not simply be adjusted to accommodate. Bowers, the 5th man, had in fact already been serving with an earlier supporting party before Scott kept him on at the last support point, and his addition now meant he, alone among the 5, would make the final push without skis, a piece of equipment issued for 4 men that could not be conjured from nowhere for a 5th. They hauled on across a plateau that offered no shelter from wind that could scour the surface into hard, wave-like ridges of snow capable of catching a ski or a sledge runner without warning. Behind them, on the far side of the same mountain range, Amundsen's 5, still mounted on 18 well-fed dogs, pushed on across their own stretch of the plateau at a pace Scott's man-hauling party, whatever their fitness or determination, had no real way of matching. Both parties, by the second week of January 1912, were within striking distance of the same fixed point on the map, closing the last few hundred kilometers from opposite directions. one team riding on the strength of animals bred for this exact cold over countless generations, the other pulling its own weight in canvas harness across ice that punished every one of the extra mouths and extra pounds a fifth man's late addition to the party had brought with him. Neither expedition yet knew how close the other one actually was. Within days, one of them would find out in the most direct way possible, by arriving at the pole and discovering they were not the first to stand there. On 14 December 1911, Amundsen's instruments told him the party had reached the pole. 5 men, after 56 days of marching, stood together at a point on the featureless plateau that looked, by every account any of them later gave, exactly like every other point they had crossed for the preceding week. Flat, white, and marked by nothing except the readings their own sextants and compasses gave them. Because no permanent feature existed to prove the claim beyond doubt, Amundsen had the whole party take turns skiing outward in different directions from their estimated position, each man independently confirming, over the following 3 days, that the site truly sat at 90 degrees south by a margin the instruments of the day could support. The instruments themselves included a sextant, an artificial horizon of mercury shielded from the wind by a small glass cover, and a chronometer, whose accuracy after 56 days of jolting sledge travel, Amundsen had no simple way to verify, so the repeated cross-check readings mattered as much for confirming the instruments as for confirming the position. To fix the position as precisely as those instruments allowed, Hansen and Bjaaland skied out along the 4 cardinal directions from the estimated pole, each for a full 20 kilometers, planting flags at intervals to bracket the true point within a small margin of error, a method that substituted patient legwork for equipment no expedition of the day actually possessed. The 5 men planted the Norwegian flag together, all of them gripping the same pole at once as it went into the snow, a gesture Amundsen arranged deliberately so that no single man among them could ever be singled out as the one who claimed the pole alone. They built a small tent from spare material, naming it Polheim, meaning home of the pole, a name that deliberately echoed Framheim, home of the Fram, tying the expedition's 2 endpoints together in language, before either had any way of knowing whether the second name would ever be needed by anyone but themselves. Inside the camp they left a letter addressed to King Haakon VII, confirming the achievement, along with a second letter addressed directly to Robert Falcon Scott, whom Amundsen assumed would eventually reach the same spot, asking him to carry word of the Norwegian party's success home to Norway in case the Fram herself were lost on the voyage back. They left some spare equipment as well, took a final round of scientific readings for whatever value they might have to later expeditions, and allowed themselves, by most accounts, a quiet, understated satisfaction rather than any grand celebration. 5 exhausted men, a very long way from anyone who might share in it properly. Amundsen himself later admitted that reaching the pole first had given him less pure joy than he had expected, confessing in his own account that he had always felt something of a stranger to this particular white plain in a way he never had to the Arctic ice he had spent most of his career learning. Bjaaland, the champion skier among them, used part of the layover testing the surface underfoot with the same restless attention he had once brought to competitive skiing at home, noting in his own diary how strange it felt to stand on ground that offered no view, no landmark, and no proof beyond a set of numbers that this was the single point every line of longitude on Earth converged on at once. There was little time to linger. Every day spent at the pole was a day of rations spent without covering distance, and Amundsen's whole method had been built around exactly the kind of discipline that treated even a triumph as a logistics problem to be managed, rather than an occasion to relax. Hassel and Wisting spent part of the layover on camp duties, tending the surviving 18 dogs and checking sledge runners for the return, a reminder that even at the symbolic center of the whole expedition, the daily maintenance of animals and equipment did not pause for the occasion. The temperature at the pole itself, recorded across the 3 days the party stayed, never rose above roughly minus 20 degrees Celsius, even at what counted, in the Antarctic calendar, as the height of summer, a cold that made the men's stated satisfaction with the moment feel, by their own account, oddly muted rather than triumphant. Within 3 days of arriving, the party turned north again, retracing their own route back across the plateau toward the head of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, their sledges now lighter, their surviving dogs rested from a stay that had cost them nothing in forward progress, their own bodies as fit as 5 men could reasonably be after 56 days of hard marching, in temperatures that rarely rose above -20 degrees Celsius. What Amundsen left behind at Polheim was, in its way, a message aimed less at glory than at contingency, a hedge against his own possible failure to survive the journey home. He had no way of knowing, on 17 December 1911, when the party finally turned for Framheim, whether news of what they had done would ever reach Norway by any route other than the tent and its 2 letters, sitting alone now at the bottom of the world, waiting for whichever party found them next. He could not have known either that the men who would eventually find that tent were only a little over a month behind him, already crossing the same glacier system from the far side of the mountains, still believing as they climbed that the pole ahead of them remained entirely unclaimed. Before striking the tent's flap for the last time, Amundsen looked back once at Polheim standing alone against the horizon, small and temporary, against a landscape with no other feature for hundreds of kilometers in any direction, and later wrote that leaving it behind felt less like a farewell than an admission that the place itself would absorb the tent, the flags, and every trace of the visit within a single Antarctic year. The return journey down the Axel Hybrid Glacier and back across the ice shelf went almost exactly as Amundsen had planned it the previous autumn, which is to say it went well. Every depot the party had laid the previous season turned up precisely where its flag said it would, stocked with exactly the food and fuel the plan had called for. The line of black markers spaced wide enough to either side of each cache that poor visibility never once cost the party a dangerous search. The dogs, rested by the stay at the pole and lightened further by every depot's supplies consumed along the way, covered the return distance at a pace that let the 5 men rest more than they marched. They reached Framheim on 25 January 1912, 99 days after they had left it, with 11 dogs surviving out of the 52 that had set out the previous October. Not one of the 5 men had suffered a serious injury, a frostbite loss, or any illness beyond ordinary fatigue. News of the achievement would not reach the outside world until the Fram herself reached Hobart, Tasmania, in March 1912, where Amundsen sent word by telegraph to Norway and separately sold the exclusive newspaper rights to his own account, a common enough practice for polar expeditions of the era trying to recover some of their costs, though it meant the wider public would not learn of the Norwegian success until months after the men who achieved it were already safely home. The achievement would be remembered as much for this margin of safety as for the pole itself, a 5-month round-trip journey of some 3,000 kilometers completed without a single death, a result that owed less to luck than to a full year of preparation built specifically around the idea that the ice deserved more caution than glory ever did. The dogs that made the full round trip, fewer than a quarter of those that had set out, were treated afterward at Framheim less as mere transport than as the expedition's actual instrument of success, fed generously, and for the survivors among them, retired from further heavy sledging for the remainder of the voyage home. Roughly 1,200 kilometers to the east, in the same final days of January and into February, a very different journey was still underway. Scott's 5-man polar party, having sent its last support team back on 4 January, continued its own march across the plateau toward the pole, hauling a sledge built for 4 men, now carrying the weight and consumption of 5, through a landscape that offered no relief from wind, altitude, and the accumulating physical toll of weeks already spent man-hauling before the final push had even begun. Temperatures on this stretch of the plateau typically sat between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius, cold enough on its own to demand constant vigilance against frostbite, even without the added strain of hauling a loaded sledge for 8 or more hours a day. Frostbite nibbled at fingers and the tips of noses. Rations, calculated with a narrower margin than Amundsen's from the start, grew leaner as the miles wore on, where Amundsen's diaries from these same weeks recorded satisfaction and plans for the party's future travels. The diaries recovered later from Scott's tent recorded increasingly simple arithmetic: how many biscuits remained, how many miles to the next depot, how many days the fuel could still last, and a fear none of the 5 spoke of often, according to the diaries later recovered, sat with them at every camp. The total absence, across everything they had seen since leaving the glacier, of any sign that another human party might already have passed this way. They had no way of knowing that the absence of such a sign meant nothing. Amundsen's route across the plateau had run west of Scott's own line of march. The 2 parties' tracks separated by enough distance that neither expedition ever crossed the other's actual path until both converged, from different directions, on the one fixed point that both routes were built to reach. For Scott's party, every extra day without a sighting fed a fragile hope that speed alone might still let them arrive first, a hope that cost them nothing to hold and everything to lose. On 16th January 1912, with the pole itself still a full day's march away by their own reckoning, one of the five spotted something dark against the endless white ahead. A small marker, unmistakably built by human hands, standing where nothing but ice and snow should have been. It was not a trick of light or a shadow on sastrugi, the hard wind-carved ridges that had scraped at their sledge runners for days. It was a flag, planted upright on a pole, exactly the kind of marker the men themselves had used to mark their own depots all season, standing now in a place none of their own party had ever been. The five men closed the remaining distance in a silence that several of them later described, in language stripped of anything but plain disappointment, as the worst part of the entire march. Worse even than what the return journey still had waiting for them. Whatever hope had carried them across the last exhausting weeks of the plateau evaporated in the time it took to walk close enough to see clearly that they were looking at the tracks of dog sledges, the paw prints of animals, and the small dark shape of a tent that did not belong to them. Scott's own party had already sent its last spare dogs back to Cape Evans weeks earlier, a decision made in keeping with the plan drawn up in England, and never revisited once the party found itself needing every available advantage on the plateau. The gap between the two expeditions' positions by this point in January, one already close to celebrating at its coastal base, and the other still hauling doggedly across a featureless plateau, was not merely a matter of distance. It was a difference in what each party still had left to give. On 17 January 1912, Scott's party reached the exact point their instruments told them was the pole, and found Amundsen's small tent, Polheim, still standing exactly where the Norwegian party had left it 34 days earlier. Wind had already begun scouring away the Norwegian party's own ski tracks by the time Scott's men arrived, leaving the tent and its flag as the only clearly legible evidence, on a plain that erased almost everything else within days, that anyone had ever passed this way before them. Inside were the letters Amundsen had left, one addressed to King Haakon VII, one addressed directly to Scott himself, asking him, if he arrived safely, to carry word of the Norwegian success home in case the Fram was lost. Scott's own diary entry that night recorded, in his own plain words, that the worst had happened, and that all the daydreams of the outward march now lay in ruins around men who had earned, by any fair measure, nothing but the confirmation of having come in second in a race they had not chosen to start. Scott also recorded the temperature at the pole as considerably colder than he had expected for the season, a detail some later analyses have connected to the same unusually severe weather pattern that would prove decisive on the return march still weeks away. None of the five spoke, in the surviving record, of blaming Amundsen for the outcome. Their disappointment, by every account, settled instead on the length of the road still ahead of them and the thinness of the margin they now had left to cover it. The five men did what the occasion still required of them regardless of how it felt. They took their own photographs at the pole, Bowers working a string rigged to the camera's shutter so that all five could appear in a single frame together, planted their own flags beside the Norwegian tent, collected Amundsen's letter to carry home as proof of what they had found, and recorded, as thoroughly as exhaustion allowed, the scientific readings the expedition's broader program had always intended to gather at this exact spot, regardless of who reached it first. Bowers, whose meticulous record-keeping through the whole expedition had already made him the party's de facto quartermaster, carefully noted the contents of Amundsen's tent, a discipline later historians have relied on, for exact knowledge of what Polheim actually contained. The photograph the five men took of themselves that day, tired faces barely visible under wind-burned skin and frost-crusted balaclavas, would become, once it was developed and printed back in Britain, more than a year later, one of the most reproduced images of the entire expedition. Five men who look, in every surviving print, considerably older than their years. Wilson, the party's doctor, and its most careful naturalist, continued collecting geological specimens even here, a discipline that would matter enormously, and in ways none of the five could have predicted, to what was eventually recovered of them. The five men spent barely a day and a half at the pole itself before turning back, in sharp contrast to the 3 unhurried days Amundsen's party had allowed itself, a difference driven less by choice than by rations that had already been calculated for a faster outward pace than the man-hauling party had actually managed to sustain. Then they turned for home, and home was now the hardest part of the entire journey, rather than, as Amundsen's party had already discovered on their own equivalent stretch, the easiest. More than 1,300 kilometers of ice lay between the pole and Cape Evans, all of it to be covered by 5 men hauling their own sledge, on rations already thinner than the plan had allowed for a party of this size, with no dogs, no ponies, and no motor sledges left anywhere along the route to help. The psychological weight of having lost the race they had marched more than 2 months to win settled over the party from the first day of the return, according to the diaries later recovered, in a way that no physical hardship alone could fully explain. The descent of the Beardmore Glacier went badly almost from the start. Edgar Evans, the party's one enlisted man, and by most accounts its physically strongest member at the outset of the whole expedition, began deteriorating faster than any of the 4 officers around him, his hands increasingly damaged by cuts and frostbite that would not heal, his mental state growing confused in a way his companions found increasingly alarming. Some later medical assessments have suggested a head injury from a fall on the glacier's broken ice, compounding the physical decline that scurvy and exhaustion were already causing, though the precise cause has never been settled beyond dispute, given how little direct evidence survives. By early February, the party had regained the barrier itself, the same flat, featureless ice shelf that had carried them south 5 months earlier, now to be crossed again in the opposite direction, with dwindling food, dwindling fuel, and a member of the party who could barely keep pace with the other 4. Every depot the autumn's laying had left along this stretch of the route had to be found exactly on schedule for the 5 men's rations to hold out, a margin considerably thinner than the one Amundsen's party had built for itself the previous season, and a margin that the barrier's own weather, in the weeks just ahead, was about to test in a way none of the 5 could have anticipated when they first planned this crossing, back in England, more than a year before. What waited for them on the barrier was not simply distance. It was a stretch of unusually severe cold, arriving earlier in the season than any previous expedition's records had prepared them to expect, layered on top of physical exhaustion, thinning rations, and a member of the party already failing badly enough that the other 4 could see, without needing to say so aloud, exactly what direction his decline was heading. Edgar Evans died on 17 February 1912, near the base of the Beardmore Glacier, the first of the 5 to go. He had grown too weak to keep pace over the preceding days, falling repeatedly, speaking less, until the morning the other 4 realized he could no longer travel at all. He died within hours. At a camp, the remaining 4 could do nothing more for him than sit beside. It left Scott, Wilson, Bowers, and Oates to cover the remaining several hundred kilometers of barrier alone, on rations calculated for a party that no longer needed to feed a 5th mouth. A grim arithmetic none of the survivors recorded taking any comfort from. What followed, through the final weeks of February and into March, was a stretch of weather that a later scientific analysis, based on the expedition's own recorded temperatures, compared against decades of subsequent Antarctic climate data, would identify as unusually and specifically severe for that particular season. Colder than the barrier crossing had any right to be at that time of year, by more than a small margin. Historians remain divided over how much this genuinely unlucky spell of cold, as opposed to the earlier planning decisions already laid down months before, decided the final outcome, and the honest position, held by serious students of the expedition on both sides of that argument, is that both factors likely mattered, working together rather than one alone explaining what happened. Lawrence Oates, a cavalry officer whose feet had been ruined by frostbite for weeks by this point, grew steadily more convinced that his own failing pace was costing the other 3 men time and rations they could not spare. Oates had commanded a cavalry unit before the expedition and had been wounded once already, in the Boer War a decade earlier, a bullet still lodged in his thigh that had shortened one leg slightly and never troubled him again until the Antarctic cold found every old injury a body carried and made it worse. On the morning of 17 March 1912, his 32nd birthday, in the middle of a blizzard that pinned the party inside their tent, Oates rose, told his companions only that he was stepping outside and might be gone some time, and walked out through the tent flap into the storm. He did not come back, and the other 3, by their own later account, did not follow him out to look. They understood exactly what he had done and why, and let him do it. The 3 who remained, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, pressed on for several more days, weakening further, until a blizzard of its own that showed no sign of breaking finally pinned them in their tent for good, roughly 18 kilometers short of the depot that held their best remaining hope. The same depot laid the previous autumn at 79 degrees 29 minutes south, rather than the fuller distance south originally planned. Whether those missing kilometers, laid down as a hedge against weakening ponies a full year earlier, actually made the difference between survival and death for 3 exhausted, starving men is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty, though it is impossible to read the diaries of these final days without noticing how often the missing distance is exactly what the men themselves kept returning to. Trapped by the storm and out of fuel to melt snow into water, the 3 men waited. Scott's diary, which he kept until his hand could no longer manage it, recorded their situation and his own thoughts with a clarity that surprised even those who knew him best when the diary was eventually recovered. His final entry, dated 29 March 1912, closed with a line asking simply and directly, for God's sake, that whoever read these words look after the people the 3 of them were leaving behind. He had also written, separately, a message intended for the wider public, rather than for his own family alone, closing with the thought that had they lived, he would have had a story to tell of the endurance and courage of his companions that would have moved any listener, and that their notes and their own bodies would now have to tell that story instead. A search party led by Edward Atkinson found the tent on 12 November 1912, 8 months after the last entry had been written inside it. The 3 men lay as they had died, their diaries, their last letters, exposed photographic film, and the geological specimens Wilson had refused to abandon even on the glacier, all still with them, preserved by a cold that had done to their bodies and their belongings exactly what the same cold does to everything it holds on to. The search party did not attempt to move the bodies. They collapsed the tent over the 3 men where they lay, built a cairn of snow blocks above it, and topped the cairn with a cross made from a pair of skis, lashed together and driven upright into the snow, the last marker either expedition would plant on that ice. News of the discovery did not reach the outside world until the relief ship carrying it reached New Zealand and cabled word onward, arriving in London on 11 January 1913, 10 months after the men had died and nearly a year after Amundsen's own success had already been celebrated in Norway. A memorial service held at St. Paul's Cathedral on 14 February 1913, attended by King George V, drew a congregation that overflowed onto the surrounding streets, treating 5 dead explorers with a solemnity a successful return might never have earned them in quite the same way. Wilson and Bowers had each left their own final letters home, found among their belongings in the tent, written in the same steady hand that had recorded scientific observations for the whole preceding year, addressed to wives and mothers rather than to history, and asking, in their own separate words, for exactly the same things Scott had asked in his, that the people left behind be looked after. 99 days had carried 5 Norwegians to the pole and home again without loss. A longer, harder season had carried 5 Englishmen to the same fixed point and left 3 of them, plus the 2 who had already died along the way, permanently on the ice that had taken exactly as long to defeat them as it had taken to reward the party that reached it first and respected it, from the very first plan drawn up in a warm room a year before either sledge ever left its hut, as something to be outlasted rather than conquered. The cross of skis above the buried tent stood through the following winter, and the winters after that, until snow accumulation and the slow seaward creep of the ice shelf itself, the same 10 meters a year that carries the whole frozen mass of Antarctica out toward the sea, eventually buried it, moved it, and carried its remains, along with the men beneath it, toward open water many kilometers offshore, a journey that is still, by most glaciologists' estimate, quietly underway today. Polheim, the small tent Amundsen's party left standing at the pole itself with its 2 letters inside, met a similar fate, swallowed by drifting snow within a few seasons, and carried off by the same slow-moving ice, its exact location now unrecoverable by anyone. Amundsen himself did not have long to enjoy his own margin of survival. In 1928, responding to news that an Italian airship had crashed in the Arctic, carrying a crew he had once quarreled bitterly with over an earlier flight together, he boarded a French seaplane out of Norway to join the search, and vanished somewhere over the Barents Sea. No trace of him, his aircraft, or the men flying with him was ever recovered. The man whose entire method had been built around discipline, preparation, and the refusal to gamble with a margin he could not afford, died in exactly the kind of improvised, underplanned rescue attempt his own younger self would very likely have argued against. Scott's hut at Cape Evans still stands on Ross Island today, preserved by the same cold that killed him, its shelves still stocked with tins from a supply order placed more than a century ago. Farthest itself is long gone, broken up and carried out to sea with the ice shelf it was built on, leaving no structure behind it all, only the record of what 5 men did there in 99 days, that another 5 men, doing almost everything differently, could not match in 5 months. 2 methods went out onto the same ice in the same season, chasing the same point on a map that was never in the end quite as fixed as either party believed, and only one of them came home to draw the comparison at all.